You already know the story of Juana the Mad, Catherine of Aragon's older sister, the aunt of Bloody Mary of England, the queen so destroyed by love that when her beautiful husband died, she would not let them bury him. You have seen the painting. A woman in black on a windswept plain, a coffin, torchlight. They say she dragged that coffin across Spain for months. They say she opened it on the road to touch his face, to kiss the mouth of a corpse that had been dead for weeks. They gave her a name for it, La Loca, the Mad One. And they say it was a mercy, in the end, that her own father and her own son locked her away where she could not hurt herself. That is the story. It is in the operas and the films and the schoolbooks. It is almost entirely a lie, not a small lie, not a detail rearranged, a 400-year lie, and there is a document that proves it, signed years before she was ever called mad, by the exact two men who would spend the rest of her life ruling the country that legally belonged to her. She was a queen in her own right. She was locked in a single room for 46 years, and somewhere in the record is a stretch of 103 days that the Mad Queen story cannot survive. This is not a retelling of the tragic madwoman. This is a case file, and the question the file asks is brutally simple. If Juana was insane, why is she recorded as calm, shrewd, and completely lucid at every single moment when her signature could have cost the men in charge their power? Not once. Every time. That is not how madness behaves. That is how a hostage behaves. So we are going to do one thing in this film. We are going to count. We are going to count every moment they declared her unfit to rule, and set it against every moment someone wrote down that she was perfectly sane, and watch which list gets longer, and watch when each one happens. Because the dates are the whole story. By the end you will understand exactly why a woman who was supposedly out of her mind was kept in a dark room, forbidden to look out of a window, for longer than most people in her century were alive. If that's the kind of history you're here for, the kind where we read the documents instead of the legend, subscribe, because this channel does nothing else. Now, let's go back to the room. Tordesillas, a small town on a bluff above the River Duero in the cold middle of Castile. It is the year 1520, and behind the shuttered windows of the royal apartments, a woman is being interviewed by a notary. She is 40 years old. She is the crowned Queen of Castile and Queen of Aragon, sovereign of the greatest empire in the world, the empire that funded Columbus, the empire whose ships are at this moment carving up a new continent. And she has not been outside these walls in a very long time. The rooms are kept dark on purpose. She has been forbidden to stand at the windows, because if the townspeople below saw their queen at the glass, they might wonder why she is never allowed out. She has been told, for years, things that are not true. Now the doors are open. A rebellion has swept across Castile. Ordinary townsmen, furious at the young foreign officials bleeding the country dry in her son's name. And they have marched on Tordesillas and thrown out her jailers. They have come to her, not as prisoners come, but as subjects come to a monarch. They kneel. They tell her the truth, that she is queen, that she has always been queen, that the men keeping her here have been governing in her name without her consent. And they put a document in front of her. One signature from the legitimate queen, and the rebellion becomes lawful, becomes not treason, but the restoration of its rightful sovereign against the son who imprisoned her. They have the pen, they have the power, they are begging her. Watch what she does. Because a madwoman, the drooling, coffin-kissing lunatic of the legend, a madwoman signs. A madwoman, desperate and confused and free for the first time in a decade, grabs the pen and does whatever the kind people in front of her say. That is not what happens in this room. The notary leans in and records what he sees, and what he writes down is a woman of, in his words, clear intelligence and sound judgment. She listens. She asks questions. She understands, precisely, that whatever she signs will be used in a civil war, and that if the rebels lose, the paper in front of her is her death warrant and her son's justification. And so, day after day, with perfect courtesy and perfect calculation, she declines to sign anything at all. Remember this room. Remember the pen she would not touch. We are going to come back to it, and when we do, it is going to bring the whole legend down. But to understand why 103 days in this room matters so much, you have to understand the 40 years of lies that led to it, and the story the world was told instead. So let us start where the world starts it, with a girl who was never supposed to be queen. Here is the version you were taught. Juana was born in Toledo in 1479, the fourth child of the two most powerful monarchs in Europe, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Catholic monarchs, the couple whose marriage stitched Spain together, drove out the last Muslim kingdom at Granada, and gambled on a Genoese sailor named Columbus. Juana was a spare. Ahead of her stood a brother, an older sister, a nephew, a whole hedge of heirs between her and any throne. She was raised brilliant. She spoke Latin. She was trained in music and philosophy. She was, by every account, sharp and serious and devout. And because she was a fourth child, she was spent the way fourth children were spent, on a marriage of state. In 1496, at 17, she was shipped north to marry Philip of Burgundy, Philip the Handsome, Archduke of Austria, heir to the Habsburg dynasty. It was a political match, one half of a double alliance aimed at boxing in France, and it dropped a devout Castilian teenager into the glittering, alien, and openly hostile Flemish court of Burgundy. She arrived speaking the wrong language, praying the wrong way, surrounded by people who saw her as a useful foreign womb and little else. And the legend says that this is where the madness began, because Juana, they say, fell for her husband with a violence that was not sane. She was obsessed with him, consumed by him, and Philip, golden, charming, and faithless, gave her every reason for jealousy, because he slept with whoever he liked. The story says her love curdled into something monstrous, fits of rage, screaming at his mistresses. Once, the story goes, attacking one of them with a pair of scissors, hacking at the woman's hair. This was not a wife who was hurt. This was a wife who was ill. Then, the legend says, fate loaded the crown onto exactly the wrong head. And here you have to understand just how unlikely it was that Juana would ever wear it, because the throne came to her only through a run of deaths, so cruel it reads like a curse. First, her only brother, Juan, Prince of Asturias, the golden heir on whom everything rested, dead in 1497, months after his own wedding, at 19. Then her older sister Isabella, Queen of Portugal, dead in 1498. Then that sister's baby son Miguel, who for a moment united the whole inheritance of Castile, Aragon, and Portugal in a single infant, dead in 1500, not yet 2 years old. 4 people stood between Juana and the crown, and within 3 years, 3 of them were in their graves. In 1502, the Castilian Parliament, the Cortes, formally recognized her as the heir, and suddenly, the 4th daughter, the spare, the difficult wife, married off to a foreigner, was the sole heir to a united Spain. In 1504, her mother Isabella died, and Juana became Queen of Castile in her own right. A queen regnant, not merely a king's wife, a woman who held the crown by her own blood. That distinction is the hinge of everything that follows. A queen consort is a decoration. You can ignore her. A queen regnant is the state. To rule Castile now, legally, you needed Juana, her person, her presence, her signature, which meant that anyone who wanted to rule Castile without her needed a reason she could not give it. They needed her to be incapable. And then, the story says, she broke completely. In 1506, Philip, her whole world, her obsession, died suddenly at Burgos, a young and healthy man dead in 5 days. And Juana lost her mind. She refused to accept it. She would not let them bury him. She had his coffin exhumed and carried it with her across the roads of Castile, travelling by night, opening the casket to gaze at the rotting body, to embrace it, to kiss it, jealous of it even in death, refusing to let any woman come near it. This, they say, is the true face of Juana la Loca, a queen so broken by love and grief that she was no longer fit to be trusted with herself, let alone a kingdom. And so, reluctantly, sorrowfully, first her father Ferdinand, and then her son Charles, took the burden of ruling from her hands and shut her away at Tordesillas for her own good. She stayed there, mad and declining, for 46 years, until she died in 1555 at the age of 75. That is the official story. It is tragic, it is tidy, and it has one enormous problem. Every single man who told it profited from it. So before you accept a word of it, notice a few things. Notice that a woman's madness was diagnosed not by a physician, but by the two men who wanted her throne. Notice that her supposed insanity became convenient at the precise moment she inherited a crown. And notice one date in particular, June 1506, a few months before Philip died, and hold on to it, because at that meeting, her father and her husband signed something. Remember that there was a document. It is going to matter more than anything else in this film. Let us build the case the way the record actually reads, in order, one piece at a time. And let us keep score, because the score is the argument. Tell number one, the jealousy was real, and it was ordinary. Start with the marriage, because the marriage is where they planted the seed of madness, and the seed is rotten. Yes, Juana loved Philip, and yes, she was jealous, and yes, there were scenes. But look at what she was jealous of. Philip was a serial, flagrant adulterer. He humiliated her publicly and constantly. And now look at who was holding the pen. This is the part the legend skips. When Juana arrived in Flanders at 17, she did not arrive as a queen. She arrived as a foreign bride, dropped into a Burgundian court that had no use for her except as a womb and an alliance. That court controlled everything around her. It controlled her Spanish household, dismissing her people, replacing them with Philip's. It controlled her money, keeping her financially dependent, and at times, humiliatingly short of funds. And here is the detail that matters most. It controlled her correspondence. Every letter she sent home to Spain, every report of how the marriage was going, passed through the hands of Flemish officials whose entire interest was in presenting Philip's version of events. So when Juana raged at a mistress, or wept, or refused to eat until Philip came back to her bed, that behavior did not reach her parents as a betrayed young wife is unhappy. It reached them, filtered, shaped, and forwarded by people with a motive, as the Archduchess is unstable. The paper trail of Juana's madness does not begin in a doctor's chamber. It begins in the mailroom of a hostile foreign court, written by the very people who profited from making the Spanish bride look like she could not cope. Flanders is not where the madness started. Flanders is where the frame started, the first draft of a story that would be revised and reused for the next 50 years. A young foreign bride, cut off from her own people, cheated on openly, whose every outburst is edited into evidence before it ever leaves the building. That is not a medical condition. That is a completely rational response to being betrayed and imprisoned in her own marriage, reported by her jailers. Historians make a devastating comparison here. A century and a half later, King Philip V of Spain suffered from crushing, documented, years-long depression, melancholy so severe he sometimes would not leave his bed or dress himself. Nobody moved to depose him. He reigned for nearly half the 18th century. The difference between him and Juana is not the symptoms. The difference is that he was a man, and a king's madness was a burden to be managed, while a queen's madness was a door you could walk through to take her crown. That's tell number one. The behavior they called insane in her would have been called grief, or temper, or nothing at all, in a man. And in her, it was written down by people who needed it to count against her. Keep counting. Tell number 2, the timing. Watch when the accusations of unfitness arrive. Not when she was a jealous young wife in Flanders. Plenty of people found her difficult then, but nobody was drawing up papers to strip her of power, because she had no power to strip. The word unfit enters the record at the exact moment she becomes worth removing. And that moment is a death. Her mother Isabella dies on the 26th of November, 1504. Stand in Castile the week that happens, because the whole machine turns here. Isabella, the great Queen of Castile, is dead, and her will is read, and the will is the first tell inside the tell. Isabella names Juana her heir. The crown is Juana's, unambiguously, by blood and by law. But Isabella also knew her daughter was far away in Flanders and married to an ambitious foreigner, so she hedged. The will provided that if Juana was absent from Castile, or unwilling or unable to govern, her father Ferdinand should govern in her place as regent. Read what that clause becomes in the hands of men who want it. Isabella meant it as a safety net. Ferdinand reads it as a keyhole, because now there is a legal path to ruling Castile without the Queen. You simply have to establish that the Queen is one of those things, absent, unwilling, or unable. And unable is the softest of the three. Unable is a door you can open with a diagnosis. So watch the two men move. Ferdinand had ruled Castile alongside Isabella for 30 years. Castile was the richer, larger kingdom. His own Aragon was the junior partner, and he had no intention of handing the greater crown to his daughter and the Habsburg son-in-law he despised. He wanted to keep governing as regent, and Isabella's will handed him the legal language to try. Then, from the other direction, comes Philip. In 1506, Philip and Juana sail from Flanders and land in Castile, and Philip comes not as a consort, but as a claimant. He intends to be King of Castile in his own right, ruling in fact, not standing decoratively beside a reigning wife. The Castilian nobility splits down the middle, some backing the father, some backing the husband, the kingdom tipping towards civil war between two men over a throne that legally belonged to neither of them. It belonged to the woman standing between them, and that is the woman both of them need to disappear. Ferdinand needs her unable, so the regency clause activates and he keeps Castile. Philip needs her unable so that he, as her husband, rules in her stead. Two enemies, two opposite ambitions, one shared prerequisite. The queen must be incapable of ruling, and within 18 months of her becoming queen, they stop being rivals long enough to get exactly that, in writing. Notice the sequence carefully. The rumors of her instability do not bubble up from doctors or from her household. They are pushed, deliberately, by Philip and by Ferdinand, each of whom needed the queen sidelined, and each of whom stood to lose everything if she were allowed to simply rule. The men who most needed her mad are the men who first called her mad. Tell number 2. The diagnosis follows the inheritance. It does not precede it. Nobody drafted a paper against Juana while she was a powerless bride. The papers appear the instant she holds a crown two men want. Madness arrived precisely when madness became profitable, and it arrived on the lips of exactly the people who profited. Tell number 3. The document nobody was supposed to see. June 1506. The town of Villafafila, a nothing place on the plains of Leon. Two men ride in to meet who, by every account, cannot stand the sight of each other. Ferdinand, the father, has just been effectively shoved out of Castile by his own son-in-law. Philip has arrived with a foreign army at his back, and the Castilian nobles peeling away toward the younger, richer, handsomer claimant. Ferdinand is the loser here. He is being humiliated, outmaneuvered, pushed back toward his smaller kingdom of Aragon. Philip is winning. These two would happily see each other dead, and they sit down together anyway, because there is exactly one thing on earth they both want, and neither can take it without the other's signature. So they carve her up. That is what the Concord of Villafafila is, a property settlement, a division of spoils, and the property being divided is a living queen and her kingdom. Watch what each man walks away with. Philip gets Castile. He is recognized as king. The crown Juana holds by blood is handed to her husband to wield. Ferdinand gets to withdraw, with his dignity and his interests intact. He keeps Aragon, he keeps his hold on the Italian territories, on Naples, and he secures a substantial income out of the Castilian revenues, a pension, in effect, paid for stepping aside. Father takes the money and the south. Husband takes the throne and the north. And to make the whole transaction legal, both of them have to sign the same underlying claim, the one clause that makes carving up a reigning queen's kingdom something other than treason. And there it is, buried in the Concord. Both men set down, in writing, that Juana's, their word, infirmities and passions make her unfit to govern, and they agree that if she should try to involve herself in the rule of her own kingdom, they will jointly prevent it. Sit inside that sentence, because it is the closest thing this whole case has to a signed and dated confession. Two men who hate each other, who agree on nothing else in the world, who are actively fighting over her crown, reach across that hatred to co-sign, with their own hands, the single document that says the Queen is mad. Not a doctor, not a physician who examined her. The two beneficiaries. They wrote the diagnosis themselves. And now the dates. Hold the dates, because the dates are the murder weapon. This clause is signed in June 1506, the event that supposedly drove Juana insane, Philip's sudden death, the grief, the coffin, the whole collapse, does not happen until September 1506, 3 months later. The men who ran her life certified her as unfit to rule 3 months before the tragedy that the legend says unhinged her. And while the supposed cause of her madness was still alive, healthy, and sitting across the table from her father, haggling over her kingdom. The paperwork of her insanity predates the grief that explains it. You cannot be driven mad by a death that has not happened yet. They did not observe a madwoman and write it down. They needed a madwoman, and they wrote her into existence, into a contract, months early, because they had already agreed on how to split what her madness would leave lying on the table. Remember this document. It is the plant, and it detonates later, and when it does, it takes the whole legend with it. For now, mark it as tell number 3, and mark that it is a very different kind of thing from the first two. The first two are patterns. This one is signed. This one is dated. This one is motive, with 2 signatures on it. That's 3. Keep counting. Tell number 4, Philip dies, and Ferdinand does something revealing. September 1506. Barely 3 months after the secret clause, Philip the Handsome is dead. A fever, 5 days, gone, at 28. Poison was whispered. Typhoid or plague is likelier. We will never be certain, and it does not matter for our case. What matters is what Juana was doing. She was pregnant with their 6th child. She was, by any human measure, a widow in shock. And what did her father do with his grieving pregnant daughter, the Queen of Castile? He came back to Spain, took the reins of government into his own hands, and quietly, this is the tell, declared the Villa Fafila Concord void. He cancelled the document. Think about what that means. If Juana were genuinely, permanently insane, you would not need to cancel the paper that said so. You would frame it and hang it on the wall. Ferdinand voided it because it had done its job. It was never a medical finding. It was a tool, used and discarded. A diagnosis you can cancel when it is no longer convenient is not a diagnosis. It is a contract. Tell number 4, and now the pattern has a spine. Tell number 5, the father who tried to breed his own daughter out of existence. This one is not about Juana's mind at all. It is about what her father was willing to do to her line, and it exposes the motive better than any single document. Watch Ferdinand's private moves. In 1505, the year after Isabella died and Juana became queen, the widowed Ferdinand, a man in his 50s, married an 18-year-old French princess named Germaine de Foix. This was not sentiment. It was arithmetic. Ferdinand's own grandson, Juana's son Charles, was set to inherit not just Castile, but Aragon, Ferdinand's own kingdom, uniting everything under the Habsburgs. Ferdinand did not want that, so he married a teenager for one reason: to father a new son who would inherit Aragon and split it away from Juana's children entirely. In other words, the man telling the world he can find his daughter out of paternal love and medical necessity was, at the very same time, actively trying to produce a rival heir to disinherit her bloodline. And it very nearly worked. Germain bore him a son, Juan, in May 1509, a boy who, had he lived, would have carved Aragon out of the inheritance and undone Juana's children. The infant died within hours of birth. The unification of Spain that we now treat as destiny survived by an accident of a few hours in a cradle, against the wishes of the grandfather who is supposed to be the loving jailer of the story. Ask yourself, does a father who is genuinely only trying to protect a sick daughter also try to breed her descendants out of their inheritance? Tell number 5, and it is the one that shows you what this was really always about. It was never her mind, it was her crown, and the crowns that would flow from her body. Keep counting. Tell number 6, the coffin, the thing you were sure of, did not happen. Now we come to the image at the center of the legend, the one everybody knows, the Mad Queen dragging the corpse across Spain, opening the coffin, kissing the dead man's face. A modern historian went back to the contemporary documents and took this scene apart, piece by piece. And here is what the record actually says. Philip's body was embalmed, as royal bodies were. Juana did move his coffin toward Granada, because Philip's own will asked to be buried in Granada, so she was carrying out his written wishes, not defying reason. The procession traveled at night, because traveling with torchbearers by night was standard, dignified funeral protocol for a king, not a symptom. She refused to let women approach the coffin, and the legend calls that jealousy, but the actual reason is that the body rested at Carthusian monasteries along the route, and the Carthusian order's rules forbade women from those spaces. She was observing monastic law. The journey stopped, not because she wandered mad across the plains, but because she went into labor and gave birth to her daughter in January 1507, and the detail that ends the necrophilia story for good. Once Philip's body was finally laid to rest near her at Tordesillas, in all her decades there, she never once asked to visit his tomb, never opened it, never went to it. The woman who supposedly could not be parted from the corpse spent 46 years a short walk from it and never went to look. The coffin legend is not an exaggeration of something true. It is a fabrication built on top of a completely ordinary royal funeral. Tell number 6, and it is the biggest one yet, because it is the load-bearing image of the entire myth, and it is false. Let me stop the count for one line, because this is one of the 2 places in this film where I have to ask you something, while it's raw. If you have ever had the worst thing that ever happened to you rewritten by someone else into evidence that there was something wrong with you, tell me below. I read every comment on this channel, and I promise you, Juana is not the only one who lived it. Now back to the count. Tell number 7, the machinery of confinement, and the 4-year lie. 1509, Ferdinand has her confined to the palace at Tordesillas. She is 30 years old. Her father then rules Castile in her name until his own death in 1516. 7 years of governing a kingdom that is legally hers, while she sits in it, silent. Understand what those 7 years actually were. Ferdinand was not a caretaker holding the fort for a sick woman until she recovered. He governed Castile as if the throne were his own. In the name of a daughter he kept walled up in Tordesillas, and never once tried to restore to health or to power, because a restored Juana was the end of his regency. When Ferdinand finally dies in 1516, the crown of Aragon falls to her too, so now she is twice a queen, sovereign of Castile and of Aragon, the 2 halves of Spain, joined in one imprisoned body. and her teenage son Charles arrives from Flanders. A boy raised in Burgundy who barely spoke Spanish is made co-monarch alongside his mother. Co-monarch, note, because even his own claim depended on hers being real, and inherits the machine. Charles had every incentive his grandfather had, and one more besides. His entire legitimacy in Spain flowed through the woman in the tower. If she was sane and free, she was the true and only monarch, and he was, at best, her heir-in-waiting. So Juana Sane was a threat to her own son's crown. And under Charles, the confinement stops being mere custody and becomes something colder and more deliberate, run by a warden named the Marquis of Denia. Listen to what the Denia regime actually did, because these are not my adjectives. They come out of Denia's own letters to the emperor. He kept her in rooms that were deliberately dark. He forbade her to look out of the windows, and he wrote to Charles explaining why. Because if the townspeople saw her, or if she called out to them, they might realize she was being held against her will and against her right. He cut her off from nearly all contact with the outside world. And here is the detail I need you to hold. When family members died, Denia lied to her about it for years. In one documented case, he maintained the fiction that a dead relative was still alive, complete with fabricated news, rather than let her have the truth, because he judged that managing her grief was inconvenient. They fed her false information about her own family, kept her in the dark literally and figuratively, and then pointed at her confusion, her suspicion, her despair, and said, "See how mad she is. Do you see the trick? The confinement was not treating an illness. The confinement was manufacturing the symptoms it claimed to treat. Lock anyone sane in a dark room for years, lie to them about whether their family is alive, forbid them the window, and then call their deterioration proof you were right to lock them up. Tell number 7, and it is the cruelest yet." And the same warden, Denia, in one of those letters, floated to the emperor that applying physical force to her, torture, would, in his words, be a service rendered to God and to her highness. That is the mind that had custody of the Queen of Spain. That is the source most of our evidence of her madness actually comes from. A jailer with every reason to prove his prisoner needed jailing. So here is the running score before the reveal. On one side of the ledger, the moments she was declared unfit, the secret clause of 1506, the confinement of 1509, the warden's regime under Charles. 3 formal moments where the men in charge put it on record that Juana could not rule. On the other side of the ledger, we so far have common sense, the ordinary jealousy, the profitable timing, the cancelled document, the father who tried to breed out her line, the dismantled Coffin legend, the manufactured symptoms. Reason is winning, but reason is not proof. To break the legend completely, we need the one thing a Mad Queen story cannot survive. We need someone the men in charge could not control to put the real queen on the record. And that is exactly what walked through the doors of Tordesillas in the summer of 1520. Go back to the room, the one I told you to remember. 1520. The rebellion, the revolt of the comuneros, has thrown out the jailers, and the rebels are on their knees in front of the real queen with a pen and a document. Here is what the Mad Queen legend needs to be true in that room. It needs Juana to be incapable, because if she is the drooling lunatic of the paintings, this is the moment it shows. Freed, overwhelmed, surrounded by people telling her what she wants to hear, she should be a wreck or a puppet. Instead, the men who were there wrote down what they saw, and it is the single most dangerous piece of evidence against 400 years of history. The rebels held Tordesillas and held the queen for 103 days. 103 days, that is the number. Hold it. Because the legend can survive a lot, it can survive a good day here and there. What it cannot survive is 103 consecutive days of a lucid, reasoning, strategically brilliant queen, witnessed by hostile and neutral parties alike. And that is exactly what the record gives us. The notaries who examined her wrote that she spoke with clear intelligence and sound judgment, and the most powerful witness of all was not a rebel at all, It was Cardinal Adrian of Utrecht, the man Charles himself had left in charge of Spain, a future pope, a figure with every reason to support the official story. Adrian reported back to the emperor that almost all of the queen's own servants said she had been oppressed and detained by force for 14 years, when in truth, he wrote, she had always been in her right mind and as prudent as when she married. As prudent as when she married. The emperor's own regent, in writing, to the emperor, now detonate the plant. Remember the secret clause of Villa Fafila, the document from 1506 where her father and husband certified her unfit. Set it against this. The clause was signed by two men who profited, in private, before any illness, and then cancelled by one of them when it suited him. This, the assessment of 1520, was made in the open, over 103 days, by notaries and by the emperor's own cardinal, none of whom gained anything by telling the truth, and one of whom lost by it. One of these is a diagnosis, the other is a contract, and they say opposite things. When you weigh a paid private verdict written to justify a seizure of power against an open, hostile, on-the-record examination that had nothing to gain, the private one is worthless. The whole legal foundation of her 46-year imprisonment was the first document, and the first document is a lie its own author admitted by voiding it. But the deepest proof in those 103 days is not what she said, it is what she did. Because the rebels did not just want to admire their sane queen. They wanted her signature. Sign against Charles, they said, and the rebellion is legitimate, and you are free, and you are truly, finally, queen. A madwoman signs. A grateful, confused, freed prisoner signs. Juana, grieving, isolated for a decade, offered her liberty and her crown in a single stroke, read the situation with cold, sane, political clarity. She understood that if she signed and the rebels lost, she had signed her own death warrant. She understood that whatever she put her name to would be used in a civil war against her own son. And so, for 103 days, she refused. Not with the panic of the mad, but with the careful, courteous, endless excuses of a shrewd sovereign who would not be used by anyone, not by the rebels, and not by the son who caged her. It is the single most rational act in the entire story, and she performed it under the most extreme pressure of her life. That is not a woman who cannot rule. That is a woman ruling, refusing to be a rubber stamp for either side, from inside a prison. Now run the whole scoreboard again through this one lens, because every tell we counted snaps into place at once. The ordinary jealousy, of course it was ordinary. The sane queen of 1520 is the same woman. The profitable timing, of course the diagnosis followed the inheritance. It was never about her mind. The cancelled document, of course Ferdinand voided it. You only void a tool. The father, breeding a rival heir, of course he did. A man who wanted her line gone was never protecting her. The Coffin legend dismantled. Of course it was fabricated. It had to be, to explain away a woman who was never mad in the first place. The manufactured symptoms in the dark rooms, of course they manufactured them, because the raw material, the actual Juana, kept turning out to be sane, and a sane queen is the one thing the whole arrangement could not afford. Every exception fits. There is only one reading of this record that explains all of it, and it is not madness, it is motive. Let me be careful and honest here, because this channel does not lie to you even to win an argument. Was Juana perfectly, clinically well? We cannot say that, and I will not. She almost certainly suffered from deep, real depression, melancholy, grief that went bone deep after Philip's betrayals and his sudden death, and then decades of true isolation that would corrode anyone's mind. There was even mental illness in her family. Her own grandmother was confined for it, so a vulnerability may have been real. Modern historians who have re-examined everything do not claim she was a picture of health. What they claim, and what the record overwhelmingly supports, is far more damning than that. It is that she was a grief-stricken, depressive woman who was nonetheless demonstrably, repeatedly, on the record sane at every moment that mattered, and that her ordinary human suffering was seized, weaponized, exaggerated into congenital lunacy, and written into law by the exact men who needed her gone. She was not the babbling madwoman of the legend, and she was lucid precisely, suspiciously, provably. Whenever her sanity was the most inconvenient thing in Spain, the rebellion failed, imperial forces retook Tordesillas, the doors closed again, and Juana, the sane queen who had just proven she could not be used, was worth even less to her son free than she had been before. She went back into the dark, and now I need you to actually live in that dark with her, because this is the part the story always sprints past, and it is the part that matters most. The number everyone remembers is the 103 days. Hold that up against the number nobody says out loud. After 1520, after notaries and the emperor's own cardinal had put it in writing that she was sane, as prudent as when she married, Juana was kept locked in those rooms for 35 more years, roughly 13,000 more days of confinement, imposed on a woman her own captor's regent had certified as lucid. Sit with that arithmetic before you go any further. They had the proof, they had it notarized, and they caged her anyway, for another third of a century. So let us do to the confinement what we did to the accusation. Read the record, dated, in order. The warden is the Marquis of Denia, installed by Charles, and almost everything we are told about Juana's madness in these years comes from Denia's own letters to the emperor, a jailer writing to the man who pays him, with every reason to prove his prisoner needs jailing. Read those letters as what they are, and a system of deliberate cruelty falls out of them, item by item. First, the rooms. Denia keeps her in chambers deliberately kept dark, and he forbids her the windows. He does not hide his reasoning. He writes it to Charles. If the queen is seen at the glass, or worse, if she calls down to the townspeople of Tordesillas, they might realize that a sane and rightful queen is being held against her will, and they might do again what the comuneros did. The darkness is not for her health. The darkness is to keep the neighbors from noticing they have a prisoner monarch. He writes the cover-up down in his own hand. Second, the forged death. This is the one that should stop you cold. When people Juana loved died, Denia did not tell her. In one documented case, he kept up the fiction that a dead relative was still living, for years, manufacturing the lie, so that the truth would not agitate a woman whose grief he found inconvenient to manage. Think about the machinery of that. A member of her family is in the ground, and her keeper decides she will go on believing them alive and sustains it, day after day, rather than let the Queen of Spain grieve her own dead. And then, this is the trap, when her instinct tells her something is wrong, when she senses the lie and grows suspicious and distressed, that distress goes into the file as another symptom. See the circle it draws. They lie to her about who is alive. Her confusion is the predictable result of being lied to, and her confusion is then produced as evidence that she was mad all along. The confinement was not treating an illness. The confinement was a factory, and its product was the very symptoms it claimed to be treating. Third, and this is the line that tells you exactly what kind of custody this was. In one of those same letters, Denia floats to the emperor that applying physical force to the queen, torture, would, in his words, be a service rendered to God and to her highness. That is the man who had charge of her body, a jailer musing on paper that torturing a sovereign would be a favour to heaven and to her. And Charles, receiving these letters, leaves him in place. And so it runs, year after year, in the dark, until the very end. On the 12th of April 1555, in the same town, in the same rooms she had entered as a woman of 30, Juana of Castile dies. She is 75 years old. She has been Queen of Castile for 51 years and Queen of Aragon for 39, and in all that time she has been permitted to rule for none of them. She has outlived her husband, her father, and the Marquis who kept her in the dark. She has spent 46 years, nearly 2/3 of her entire life, inside a handful of rooms she was not allowed to leave, 35 of them, after the men who caged her had it in writing that she was sane. That is where the Mad Queen story ends, not with a lunatic dying in her madness, with a lucid old woman, finally released, the only way they would ever release her. Here is the injustice, stripped to the bone. This was not one cruel man. It would almost be easier if it were. It was a system, running smoothly across 3 reigns. Her father found her conveniently mad when he needed the regency. Her husband certified it in writing when he wanted the crown. Her son inherited the arrangement and perfected it, because letting his mother be sane would have meant admitting his own throne sat on top of a woman he was keeping in a cage. Ferdinand, the model prince, the man Machiavelli held up as the ideal ruler, half of the glorious Catholic monarchs, jailed his own daughter and married a teenager to try to breed a rival heir who would cut her children out entirely. Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Christendom, kept his own mother in a dark room for 39 years. History gave both of them their crowns and their reputations, and gave her a nickname, La Loca. The system did not just imprison her body, it authored her, and it won, and for 4 centuries we recited its verdict as if it were hers. And if that name feels far away, a Spanish queen in a Castilian tower, 4 centuries and a language removed from you, understand how close this story actually sits to one you already know. Juana had a little sister, the baby of the family, born 3 years after her. Her name was Catherine of Aragon. Yes, that Catherine. The one who sailed to England, married Henry VIII, and was cast aside when she could not give him a son, discarded and slandered and written out by a man who needed her gone. And Catherine had a daughter, Juana's own niece, a girl who would grow up to be Queen of England and be handed a nickname of her own by the men who wrote the history, Bloody Mary. Look at the bloodline. The aunt called mad and locked away by the men who wanted her throne. The younger sister called a barren failure and thrown aside by the man who wanted a different wife. The niece called bloody and monstrous by the enemies who inherited her crown. 3 queens, 1 family, 3 verdicts, and every one of those verdicts was written by the people who profited from them. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. That is what happened to women who held power, or stood next to it, in a century that had decided their crowns were only ever loans from the men around them. Now I want you to actually stand in the room with her, because the record lets us. Imagine you are Juana. You are a queen twice over. The law of 2 kingdoms says the power is yours. And you wake, every morning, in a room deliberately kept dark. You are not allowed to stand at the window, because someone below might see you and start asking questions. You are handed letters, and you cannot fully trust that a single one of them is real, because you have learned that the people around you will lie to your face about whether your own family is alive. You know you are sane. You can feel your own mind working, clearly, the whole time. And you know that the more clearly you think, the more they need to insist that you cannot. Every reasonable thing you say is filed as another symptom. There is no argument you can make for your own sanity that the system cannot rewrite as proof of madness, because the people writing it down are the people who profit from the diagnosis. Sit in that for a moment. Not the madness, the sanity, 46 years of it, in the dark, being told it was the disease. So here is the question, and I genuinely want you to fight about it in the comments, because you know more than the legend ever told you now. There are 3 ways to read Juana of Castile. 1. She was truly, clinically mad, and the confinement, however cruel, had some real basis. 2. She was a grief-stricken, depressive woman, wounded, yes, but fundamentally sane, and criminally wronged. 3. The truest verdict isn't about her mind at all. It's that it never mattered whether she was sane. because a system of father, husband, and son had already decided her crown was worth more to them than her freedom, and would have called her mad no matter what. Which one do you believe? Watch the 103 days again in your head before you answer. Then tell me below, and drop the city you're watching from, because I want to see how far her name has finally travelled, 400 years after they tried to bury it with her. Subscribe if you think she earned it. I read every single comment.